Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Peter said, my name is Daniel Hahn. I'm the chair of the Translators Association and the interim director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. And I'm delighted to be here with you on a special and unusual event. It's unusual because it's a celebration of the work of literary translators. Almost by definition, some of the best, some of the greatest literary translators are those whose work is the most inconspicuous. They're the ones who you almost don't notice they're there at all. Translators are, as it were, vocationally invisible when not being banned. What was that? Banned, burned, and a very distressing idea. Strangled, thank you. When we're not being banned, burned, and strangled, we are at best invisible. So it's unusual and I think rather lovely to have an evening like tonight when we're celebrating translators' work, when we're dragging them out of the shadows and putting them and their work in the spotlight for the evening. It's also lovely, I think, to be celebrating literary translation because as a translator myself, I feel like we spend rather a lot of time, I think whinging is probably not too strong a word, making our dissent known. And we complain rather a lot, I think, about publishers and editors and literary editors and reviewers and booksellers and basically everyone else who is more stupid and craven than we are, because somehow we don't quite accept this idea that we shouldn't have more translation in this country. So it's lovely to have an evening where we're accentuating the positive. One of the things that, certainly one of my more persistent, more probably tedious gripes as a translator is not, however, about publishers and literary editors and readers, but about writers. In this country, curiously, we don't have the kind of culture that you'd find in most European countries, where novelists writing in English are expected to engage with international writing and engage with translation. If you were to get, I think, half a dozen Spanish novelists in a room together, you would find that most of them are also occasional translators. Most of them will be very well read in English writing. Somehow it's not something we expect of our writers in this country. But given that I'm accentuating the positive tonight, that's a rather easy thing for me to do because I'm introducing you to a writer who is an exception. She is an exceptional writer, and she is Ali Smith. Ali Smith is... you know that thing people do when they say someone needs no introduction and then introduces them anyway. This is what we're going to do now. Ali Smith needs no introduction. She is, of course, as you know, a very fine novelist, the author of novels including Hotel World, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the Orange Prize, The Accidental, which was shortlisted for both of those prizes and also won the Whitbread Award, collections of short stories including Other Stories and Other Stories, and The Whole Story and Other Stories. But as well as being a very fine writer, she's also someone who is I was going to say a champion of international writing, but it's somehow more than that. She's someone who reads and appreciates international writing. She's been a judge of the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, which I can say, speaking personally as someone who's judged that prize myself, is a considerable amount of sort of investment. When I was talking to Ali earlier this evening, she mentioned that she's still having nightmares about this, and this was 2007. She's written and spoken about translation before, and she has a sort of, I'm not sure how to describe it, but sort of a panorama as a reader, which is much broader than you would expect from most readers in this country. You can see this just from things like, if you look at the books of the year that writers select at the end of the year in the broadsheets, where I think it was the year before last when everybody was talking about Jonathan Franzen and Ali had found a new translation of a Stefan Zweig book to recommend. In 2006, she published something called The Book Lover, which was a collection of pieces of writing by writers she loves. And among the English language writers there, you also find Rilke, and you also find Calvino, Dubravka Ugrasic, you find Miloš, you find Clarice Lispector, and you find W.G. Sebald. W.G. Sebald, who founded the British Centre for Literary Translation, was also, as you all know, the man after whom this evening's lecture is named. So it's particularly apt, I think, that Ali's here to give us her lecture, the 2011 Sebald Lecture on Literary Translation, under the title Loosed in Translation. Please welcome Ali Smith.
Oh, I'm scared to say anything now. Hello. Can we have the light slightly up on the audience in the back? Is that possible? Just so I can see some faces. It doesn't mean that you are not allowed to doze off, which you are, because this will take just under an hour, although I promise to go fast. Homo sum, humani nil ame alienum puto. Translation? Where's Peter?
I'm a man, nothing is alien to me.
Perfectly done. The famous quote from Terence's, I don't know how you say this, Houton Timorumenus, or The Self-Tormentor, a play he adapted from an original Greek play long lost of the same name by Menander. 5 minutes on Google gave me 23 different possible English translations for these 8 words. Here are the first few. I am human and I regard no human business as other people's. I am a man and nothing that concerns me, man, do I deem a matter of indifference to me. I am a man and I deem nothing pertaining to man is foreign to me. I am a human and nothing of that which is human is alien to me. I am a human and count nothing that is of humans as alien to me. I'm human myself, so I think every human affair is my concern. I'm a man. I like to think everything is my business. I'm a human, and I consider nothing human strange to me. I am a man, and my neighbour's business is my business. Man am I. Nothing human is alien to me. None of these was Google Translate, which, after I typed the Latin in and clicked on the icon, fed me this. Am a man. Nothing human is alien to me, I think. Google Translate reminds me of when computer spell checks were new and exciting 20 years ago, and you could act like a child and type in the words salmon rushdie and have given back to you the words salmon residue. And behold, in one systemized touch, the writer was changed into a few left behind scales of a fish that can leap great distances. But Google Translate is not an Ovidian god. It's not a human being. It's not a man. I'm not a man either, of course, though I've quite enjoyed the experience of saying the phrase over and over out loud in my own voice. The level of translation this plays on with the kind of pleasure that a writer like Ovid would surely have understood, a writer for whom the notion of translation was beyond language, a trans-bordering potency, a discursive ethic, a powerful means of change, and as everyday as breathing. Is translation also Packish? Bless thee, bottom, bless thee, thou art translated, as Peter Quince says to the man whose head is an ass in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, the play in which Helena longs to be Hermia. My ear should catch your voice, my eye your eye, my tongue should catch your tongue's sweet melody. Were the world mine, Demetrius being baited, the rest I'd give to be to you translated. By translation, though it might unseat us, and there's always the possibility of ridicule or fear as well as wonder in being unseated, we can be made different, become a different person, even a different species. To translate, from the Latin translatum, the supine of transferre, from trans across beyond, and ferre to carry, to render into another language, to express in another artistic medium, to put in plainer terms, explain, to interpret the significance or meaning of an action, behaviour, etc., to remove to heaven, especially without death. To transform or convert, to enrapture, to renovate, to make new from old. Translator, noun, a person or machine that translates from one language to another. I have a theory that bad copy and poorly written language don't just diminish us, they actually make us feel physically bad. I fear the number of human jobs being lost across the world in the current business recession. People who used to translate replaced by the machine, by computer translators. The psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, not that long before the word Google turned up as a meaning in any dictionary, said this: in language itself, a dictionary is not all that's needed. One has to understand the nature of language as well as the actual language in which one's attempting to speak. If we reduce language to machine at any level of our language usage, we reduce nature to machine. What a superhuman machine a literary translator has to be then, or maybe I mean intensely human, the kind of creature to whom Borges could reputedly make the request, don't write what I say, write what I meant to say. To catch the ear beyond the ear, the eye beyond the eye of the text, the literary translator should be a near psychic maker then, a maker at the same unvoiced understanding there is between writers and translators. Borges sums up the special understanding and a great deal of what the writer takes for granted of the translator. There are also those who think literary translation is an oxymoron. An attitude summed up best by Anthony Burgess not long before his death in '93 in the lecture he gave at Cheltenham Literary Festival. To be translated is horrific. And the more ignorant the author is of foreign languages, the better off he is. If an author can be translated into innumerable languages, he's not strictly speaking a practitioner of literature at all, because literature cannot be translated, only the appearance of literature. Now, the very prolific Burgess was facing the knowledge of his own impending death when he wrote these words: death by proliferation, death of cancer cells. There's a strong possibility, and he acknowledges this himself, that this knowledge is part of his reaction here. But the word horrific, it's a standout word. In it, Burgess signals, while attempting to dismiss, the doppelganger strength in the link between writers and translators, the power of the translator. If you're a writer, translation involves a crucial communal action and a crucial release, a letting go. Any writer, worth her salt, knows that a phrase like worth her salt is just one of the examples of countless common, embedded and layered, near untranslatables of which every text is made, and which a good translator will know what to do with, not just on a simple level, but on levels of its phrasal idiom, its implications of tone, its gender shift. And this is just translation in miniature. Translation so much more than the taking of a text and the finding of a true expression for it in another language. It's an understanding of it in both languages, its original and its new form, and of the cultural shift between. A translator deals with the original, with its whole new expression, and with the dialogue between the two. And like a good author, I think, a good translator makes a seamless thing, one in which the experience of the book, both in the original and in its new translation, as alive on all terms, in terms of language, composition, form, voice, and being, is everything. Whether they know how important translators are or not, writers rely on them. A writer like I am often castigated for not having enough plot in the English original, never mind anywhere else, knows how important the recognition is of the texture in language that's beyond plot, but central to story, central to the workings of the work. But I'd say a translator's senses need to be even more open to the book than the original writers. A book can't read as a translation. It has to read true, ring true in its new form, as if written for the first time in its new language. And this asks a double skill of the translator: a fidelity to the original that's complicit but crucially open, a loyalty to and an acceptance of the book's original expression, with a similar wholehearted loyalty and openness to its brand new deliverance. Translation at foundation is one of the most creative acts. Good translators are doubly creators. Writers revere translators, and if they don't, they should. Translators are also a quick and efficient species when it comes to responding to cold call emails, and are funny with it and intelligent and also rather kind. Not being a translator myself, the first half of this lecture is made up of the responses of all the translators whose work or selves I've come in direct contact with over the 8 weeks of worrying about giving this lecture, who happened to be still alive and for whom I had or could reasonably easily find a contact address. I wrote to 15 from Oslo to Mexico, and I asked for responses to these questions. What gets lost in translation? What gets found? And what gets loosed, freed, liberated? So the second half of this lecture will be a reader's appreciation of Sebald, with a glance at the concepts of lost and found and loosed and liberated in Sebald's work, an eye to the work's own border crossing, its fusion of fiction, biography, autobiography, travel writing, history, memoir, poetry, documentary, essay, theory, illustration, natural history, aesthetic analysis into its own new genre. His finding of a trans-bordered form which ignores the fake and dangerous borders and fortifications between people and places in the same way as it ignores the artificial differentiations between the given literary genres. Nothing in Sebald's work is not contagiously connective, even in its disconnecting. Take the moment in Austerlitz, where the adult Austerlitz first literally sees his forgotten self. A small boy arrived off a kinder transport in England, in a waiting room in Liverpool Street Station. I felt something rending within me, and a sense of shame and sorrow, or perhaps something quite different, something inexpressible, because we have no words for it, just as I had no words all those years ago when the two strangers came over to me speaking a language I did not understand. The absence of the possibility of the rendering of one language into another, one state into another, will end in rend. Sebald was a writer who dealt continually with both states, the torn and the rendered. In everything he wrote, he worked towards how to render both language and silence. And this understanding he twinned with how best to work against the notion of the human horrific. And when this proved impossible, which it inevitably would, then how humanly to carry the reality of it, the knowledge and the responsibility. His subject is the damage done by cognizant or purposeful alienation, the damage of knowing human indifference. In Against the Irreversible, his essay on Jean Amery, the Austrian writer tortured in Belgium and imprisoned in Auschwitz, Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen for both his resistance and his Jewish origins, Sebald, whose aesthetic as it develops becomes one of a communal multivalence of voice in the individual voice, quotes Amery at length. Torture, from Latin torquere, to twist. What visual instruction in etymology? You don't want to listen? Listen anyhow. You don't want to know where your indifference can again lead you and me at any time? I'll tell you. Nothing is easy to translate, says Pia Yule, a translator into Danish. There's always at least one general terrible problem in every bloody book I've ever come across. Often, she says, it starts at the title. Laetitia Deveau, a translator into French, talks about the process like this. I don't always read the text before I begin to translate it. I have learnt with passing years that a first reading doesn't really help me, so I prefer to maintain the suspense right up to the end of my first draft. The second draft is like sculpture to me. I fight hand to hand with the text. I forge it, and a form begins to appear. Margaret Jill Costa, who I suspect has forged a new kind of English, exciting and syntactically limber, peripatetic and thoughtful in its very form in her translations into English of Saramago and Marias, sees translation as creative writing in reverse. She says, I try all the time to creep up on my translation and read it as if I haven't read it before. One doesn't want to overdo the questions to a long-suffering author, Anthea Bell says. My young Bosnian-born German author, Sasha Stanisic, How the Soldier Repairs the Gramophone, told me that one of his translators had about 300 questions for him. Bell is, of course, the translator into English of Sebald, alongside Michael Halson, Michael Hamburger, and Sebald himself, and is renowned for the versatility of her translations from Asterix to Austerlitz. It was good to have the advantage of working with Max Sebald himself on Austerlitz, she says, and on the main part of On the Natural History of Destruction. In translating Max's posthumous collection Campo Santo, at least I knew fairly well how his mind worked. Betty Regis, who translates her husband, the Mexican poet and the novelist Homero Regis, into English, says, the main advantage of living with the author is her availability to answer questions and resolve doubts. The main disadvantage is being reproached for looking at a newspaper or other books, or the internet, when obviously she should be busy translating. Is that what you call the too visible translator? I know there's an argument going on in the translation forum about the ethic of the visible-invisible translator, but the notion of visible translator, the translator who'd like us to know that what we're reading is foreign to us, always makes me think of Robert Creeley's wry little couplet on the problem of poets who write poems about being a poet. Look at me, I'm being sea. As Len Ricks, the translator into English from Hungarian of Serb and Szabo, succinctly puts it, written as literature, it must read as literature. This, as Margaret Jill Costa notes, means the translator always has to go beyond her or himself. The best translations, she says, have the stamp of individuality on them, but a dual individuality. But there's a much more serious invisibility to consider here, that of translation generally in UK publishing. Anthea Bell comments on the comparative rarity value of a translation into English. In contrast, translations out of English are found in profusion, to a penny, or rather, to a euro, to a dollar. Translation in the UK sits at a shameful percentage, between 1 and 3% annually, we think. The recession is bound to be having an effect on even this pitiful percentage. And Nicola Smith at ACE, according to the evidence from her talks with small publishers, says, yes, they are changing choices of titles on grounds of length, re-increasing cost of translation, and potential marketability. Most are also reporting that they've reduced the number of translations commissioned as a whole. Bookshop sales are also obviously an increasing problem with the dominance of the major players and their unadventurous approach to buying. But print on demand is helping some of the indies survive. Thank God, then, for the valiance of publishers like Pushkin, Portobello, Serpent's Tail, Arcadia, Pairini, to name only a few of the independents chipping away at UK publishers' Cyclops' eye. Sandra Smith, translator of Camus and Nemirovsky into English, sums up well this cultural and industry invisibility and the range of the damage it does. She says, Translators are often unappreciated, unnoticed when competent. Innumerable reviews never even name the translator. Otherwise, he or she is blamed when the work is poor quality. She goes on in note form. Need for more and better trained translators, but huge problem in UK with attitude towards language teaching. Not required at GCSE level, unlike policies in Europe and the US. This policy will ultimately prove disastrous for the UK. Who will become the translators into English if no one speaks a foreign language? Only 1 to 3% works published in English are in translation compared to 30 to 50% in Europe. More translations needed to bridge cultural gaps. This is terribly important in today's world where a translator's work can often mean the difference between accepting other cultures or relapsing into xenophobia. We must learn from literature as well as history. And what Sandra Smith says reveals, and rightly so, us as teetering on the edge of a crevasse for which exchange the cliché lost in translation for something more like lost because there was no translation. And this brings me to that other peculiar xenophobic cliché, traditore, a translator is always a traitor. How translators dislike these cliched phrases, how translators reveal and how texts themselves reveal that it's not what's lost, but what's desired, what's sensed as lacked, then longed for, what's brought alive, shaken alive by the attractions, the impossibilities and the possibilities, that's beautifully demonstrated in the coming together of different languages. I mean, take this moment from Virginia Woolf's Orlando, and I think there's room for work to be done on Woolf's influence on Sebald. The way her long breath, thinking, structures, the cognitive drive, the rhythmic continuance of her sentences, her sense of what happens in the meeting of the minds and nature's versions of the world, and her modernist English meditative narrative has helped shape his work as much as Thomas Bernard and the 18th and 19th century essayists. But for some reason, Woolf is almost never mentioned in the list of sanctified influences of Bernhard and Borges and Kafka and Nabokov and Perec and Conrad, though Sebald refers to her himself in at least one of the interviews he gave. Anyway, picture the young, romantic, poetic Orlando sitting on the frozen Thames with the body of an old peddler woman and who knows who else frozen beneath him in the ice, tormenting himself with mortality. And bear in mind, too, the pictures, comic and haunting, real and playful, all through Orlando. All ends in death. All ends in death. It's like a line straight out of a parody of Sebald's writing itself, until Sasha, the Russian princess, excites him to his feet by making him dance and by talking at him in French, which notoriously loses its flavour in translation, until the adventure in otherness, the fox chase after meaning, brings about in itself and in him a kind of language thaw. He forgot the frozen waters, or night coming, or the old woman, or whatever it was, and would try to tell her, plunging and splashing among 1,000 images which had gone as stale as the woman who inspired them, what she was like. Snow, cream, marble, cherries, alabaster, golden wire. None of these. She was like a fox, or an olive tree, like nothing he had seen or known in England. Ransack the language as he might, words failed him. He wanted another landscape. And another tongue. The lack and the longing are both held there in that verb want. But if, as Woolf says, the flavour gets lost, changes in translation, what exactly is the flavour and what exactly is the loss? In Eva Hoffman's memoir, Lost in Translation, the life in translated circumstances is the loss of an emotional range, of a whole compass of the self, and beyond even these, of the truth of meaning. She says, but mostly the problem is that the signifier has become severed from the signified. The words I learn now don't stand for things in the same way. When my friend Penny tells me that she's envious or happy or disappointed, I try laboriously to translate not from English to Polish, but from the word back to its source, the feeling from which it springs. Already in that moment of strain, spontaneity of response is lost. I cannot help knowing that words are just themselves. I asked the 15 translators what they thought was lost in translation, if anything. Artemis Loy, who translates into Greek, says, translation is an act in the teeth of despair. I can think of so many things that get lost that you often wonder if it's worth translating at all, she says. She specifically notes the loss of the sound of a language, the music of it, the intonation, also the economy, pictorial, graphological aspects of a language. Can you imagine Emily Dickinson's poetry without dashes? Tonality, the young translator and writer Chloe Regis says, I feel it just can't carry across languages. Lydia Davis, the American short story writer and translator most recently of Proust's Swan's Way and of Flaubert's Madame Bovary into English, says the loss really varies from one book to another, to take just the case of books. In the case of the best books, in which every sentence is calculated and fits tightly within the text as a whole, coheres with it on every level, you inevitably lose that perfect fit, or at least lose it most of the time. A sentence of Proust's, for instance, might incorporate not only a perfect Alexandrine, but also a sequence of alliterated adjectives and/or a series of vowel sounds that progressively close or open. To analyse what he's doing on a micro level is an amazing exercise. Translating Swann's Way, I could not reproduce absolutely everything he was doing, not all the time anyway. Merete Olafsson, award-winning for her translations of Austen and Woolf and Byatt, amongst many other authors, into Norwegian, says this: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a Norwegian text well written should be made up of relatively short and complicated sentences. There are Norwegian versions of Austen novels where there is nothing between the lines. The act of translation has become an act of trivialization. In fact," she says, "this might partly explain the wild discrepancy in Austen's literary reputation." And then she says, in the case of Virginia Woolf, the first Norwegian translation of To the Lighthouse was published in 1948. It was given the title De Drug til Fire. Merete, did I say that right? Okay, cool. That means they went to the lighthouse. And already, she says, Woolf's whole modernist project, her ambition of finding a new form for the novel, is lost. The title promises a conventional story. We try not to lose too much, Anthea Bell says, and to substitute something if possible for inevitable losses, or even to make a tiny addition with the author's approval. There's a place in On the Natural History of Destruction where the German phrasing irresistibly reminded me of Shakespeare's phrase, "in the dark, backward and abysm of time," and Max let me use it. This brings us to the question of what's found in translation. For a great extent, as the poet-translator George Surtees says, what gets lost in the act of translation and what gets found are two ways of looking at the same question. What's found, it seems, is a concordance, a possibility for kinship that was always there. For as Walter Benjamin says, languages are not strangers to one another. Here's how Christine Brooke-Rose saw this kinship in her 1968 novel, Between. As if languages loved each other behind their own facades, despite alles was man denkt darüber davon dazu, as if words fraternized silently between the syntax, finding each other funny and delicious in a mishmash of tender fornication inside the bombed-out hallowed structures and the rigid steel glass modern edifices of the brain. What gets found, Lydia Davis says, is of course the new text, but more interestingly, the partnership of the English language with its own history and cultural peculiarity and the foreign sensibility of a book that came out of a different language and culture. It's a unique partnership that can only happen in translation. The process, Lenrick says, is all discovery. George Surtees sees this discovery in terms of a new landscape, one where time and timelessness and closeness and distance coexist. He says, so Virgil, Horace, Baudelaire and Rilke seem to be living with us, both with us and a distance from us is the ideal, but that's maybe exactly as we live with ourselves. What gets found, says Jenny Erdle, is probably enough to say the King James Bible, which has gone on enriching our language for 400 years. The great Eastern philosophical texts have been available for only 200 years. Think how wonderful a gift that's been to the Western world, and there's still a long way to go. Erdle's mention of the King James Bible reminds me of this definition of translation, surely one of the most beautiful from its preface to the reader. Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell, that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain, that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come into the water. It's a source of light and water, it's a way to the nourishing core of things, it uncovers the spirit, openeth, breaketh, putteth aside, removeth the cover. There is freedom in constraint in translation, Margaret Jewel Costa says. In case after case, constraint becomes about freedom. Pia Yule remembers translating Gertrude Stein's Mexico, her play called Mexico, into Danish. I would call it totally untranslatable, she says, and that made it the most intriguing translation job I ever had. I was full of hope and joy because it felt impossible and I had to think in a not too despairing way and become inventive instead. Fruitful and luxurious is how Walter Benjamin chooses to characterize the act in The Task of the Translator. He says, while content and language form a certain unity in the original like a fruit and its skin, the language of the translation envelopes its content like a royal robe with ample folds. Benjamin's theory is, that a coming together of different languages releases something beyond the confines of a single language itself, in fact of all languages, something he calls pure language. It is, he says, the task of the translator to release in his or her, it's my prerogative here to add my gender to the translation, it is the task of the translator to release in his or her own language that pure language which is under the spell of another, to liberate the language imprisoned in a work, in his or her recreation of that work. Merita Alfsson gives a really persuasive example of what happens when these structures loosen. Translators work the language, she says, in a way which is different from the way people generally use it. They shake it up and turn it over. The result is a kind of general tilling of it, to the benefit of all owners and users of that language. The language itself, its uses and possibilities, are loosed in the act of translation. The Norwegian translation of Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu was translated by Anneliese Amadou, who managed to keep Proust's sometimes never-ending sentences and write him in Norwegian in a way that loosed and liberated our language forever after. Don't think that it wasn't controversial, but there it is, and it is unquestionably Norwegian. After that, Austen and Woolf could be rewritten too. In translation, not just language, but worlds and times too are loosed and collide amply, like they do in Kieran Carson's version of Dante's Inferno written in Belfast idiom, or when the late, very great Edwin Morgan in his adaptation of Gilgamesh rhymes Hambaba with Rambaba. Translation was Morgan's first nature, never mind second. His work's an open act of inclusivity and generosity. We are ourselves multiplied by the act of translation as well as the texts, as Letitia DeVoe says. We are the ones who get liberated, Lydia Davis says. We get freed from our provincial boundaries when we read work in translation. It's the act of translation that allows us to have the experience of entering another culture, travelling out of our own and inhabiting another. Imagine how imprisoned we would feel, and of course some people in this world are so imprisoned, if we were confined to works written only originally in English. The concept of translation turns up very physically near the end of the novel Austerlitz, when Austerlitz himself visits the Museum of Veterinary Medicine in Paris and comes across the exhibit of a flayed horseman by Honoré Fragonard, a man moved by a desire, says Austerlitz, to secure for the frail body at least some semblance of eternal life through a process of vitrification by translating its so readily corruptible substance into a miracle of pure glass. A man becomes a window to himself. It's shortly after this that Austerlitz suffers another breakdown, and these states always take the form of a breakdown of language, for this is a novel whose images of a Tower of Babel madness of noise and incomprehension are up against silence, whose power is the threshold to an equal madness. Translation in The Emigrants is what Paul Berater, the beloved and wrongly used teacher, teaches the boys as the most natural facility in the world, a thing of sunlit properties. One May morning, we sat outside in the schoolyard, and on that fresh, bright day, we easily grasped what un beau jour meant, and that a chestnut tree in blossom might just as well be called un châtaignier en fleur. But the concept of words and their naming provides a slippage between naive hope and real despair throughout Sebald's work, in, for instance, Austerlitz's inability at the moment of being told his real name to connect the signifier with the signified, or the word with anything meaningful at all, or, in The Emigrants, where on a visit to Bad Kissingen's Jewish cemetery, the narrator, considering the names of the dead, decides that perhaps there was nothing the Germans begrudged the Jews so much as their beautiful names, so intimately bound up with the country they lived in and with its language. And right at the start of Sebald's literary oeuvre, in the long, implacable, apocalyptic poem After Nature, where Steller, the explorer, walks the paths between the hothouses filled with tropical plants, learns one new name after another, and is almost beside himself with so much hope. Not long after he does, and when he's hounded, arrested, left ill and ruined because he's complained to the authorities about their maltreatment of the indigenous peoples in the province in which he's been happily describing, classifying and drawing, Steller will finally wholly grasp the difference between nature and society. There is fierce anger in Sebald from the start about the ways in which peoples and individuals are treated and ruined by what might be called mundane historical horror, by the systems called authority. If words and the letters that make them up, or language in its written form, offer a kind of hope or order, it's revealed as a false one in Vertigo, where a small bilingual phrase book, which belonged to the narrator's great uncle, becomes the narrator's travelling companion at the expense of his making any real connection with the two women in the same compartment as him on the train to Milan, and in which phrase book everything seemed arranged in the best of all possible ways, quite as though the world was made up purely of letters and words, and as if through this act of transformation even the greatest of horrors were safely banished, as if to each dark side there were a redeeming counterpart, to every evil its good, to every pain its pleasure, to every lie a measure of truth. Sebald signals the sweet naivety in this, the attraction to the simplicity and cleanness of its act of transformation. But everything Sebald writes can be said to be an attempt to reconcile this Jekyll and Hyde split state into something less absolute or divisive. All is language, even the reader, Christine Brooke-Rose puts it, and I think Sebald agrees. But if language and voice feature so very literally in this work, then silence is also a language, a voice in it. From the dizzy-making, fearful, Svankmajer silence of objects in an attic in Vertigo, as if this entire assemblage of the most diverse objects had been moving in some sort of secret evolution until the moment we entered, to silence's memorial, the silent lament of Giotto's angels above our endless calamities for nigh on 7 centuries. Sebald is drawn to this word muted, declares in an interview his comfort with dust as a substance. A sign of silence, somehow, he says. If I get into a house where the dust has been allowed to settle, I find that comforting. Perhaps this explains the surface antiquity of his narrative voice, a voice which couldn't be further from the wipe, clean, soundbite culture we inhabit. Perhaps it explains what Michael Hoffman calls his insouciantly, provocatively grandiloquent manner, redolent with ledgy subclauses which knowingly slow the pace of thought. But if this is grandiloquence, then it's an unexpected grandiloquence from the margins, geographically and emotionally. So what gets lost, and what gets found, and what gets loosed, freed, liberated in the work of Sebald? The literal getting lost of the narrator, either in his ramblings or his mental paralysis as he waits at another station or lies in another hotel bed, is practically a Sebaldian trope, typically here in the Rings of Saturn, when he's in Ireland, where he's taking bed and breakfast in the decay of an old aristocratic architectural pile. Whenever I rested on that bed over the next few days, my consciousness began to dissolve at the edges, so that at times I could hardly have said how I'd got there, or indeed where I was. This repeating lostness, with its veils and mists and fogs and bewilderment, is a posturing, but one that's empathetic with all human blindnesses, one that actually postures absence, in the same way as his grandiloquence postures marginality. This is enervation as dandification, the paralysed flaneur at large in a landscape of all the world's and history's troubles. It's useful to see this lostness in general philosophical terms, what George Steiner calls the Hegelian intuition of a lost-at-homeness in existence, of a necessary voyage through alienation and self-division, where self-exile seems implicit in the life of consciousness, in the capacities of the human ego to think outside and against itself. But Sebald's narratorial exile is both psychological and literal, both personal romance and political philosophical positioning, an argument for the sake and the consequence of something larger than the self. His prose is a thinking peripatetic, one in honour, you might say, of Benjamin, following on foot the marks of pain which trace countless fine lines in what's left of the century which destroyed Benjamin. His getting lost leads into and out of itself in a new version of quest. Lost in the maze at Somerleyton, his narrator arrives, as it were, at the wartime memories of a gardener he meets, William Hazel, who remembers watching the air war aircraft setting off to carpet-bomb Germany, in fact can't forget the sight, sees it again whenever I close my eyes to this day, and remembers too, as Sebald does in his lectures on the natural history of destruction, the loss, the blanking, the silencing in German consciousness of that literal occurrence. I even learnt German after a fashion so that I could read what the Germans themselves had said about the bombings. No one at the time seemed to have written about their experiences. Even if you asked people directly, it was as if everything had been erased from their minds. Later in the book, losing himself again, this time in the Borges Lear labyrinth of the heath, he finds himself finally at his friend the poet and translator Michael Hamburger's house, where he relates in first person Hamburger's own exile, his return to his childhood, to Berlin, and the culmination of blanks and losses as he stands at the door of the building he'd once lived in and, caught in a sick and bewilderingly simple-seeming puzzlement, can't solve it, can't change what's happened in the past, can't go back in. Melancholia be damned. In any close examination of the workings of his fiction, Sebald's is an inquiry into despair, which produces a tightrope balanced negotiation between the workings of the mind and the state of being out of your mind. His art proliferates with asylums, with the assertion that mental suffering is effectively without end, in a literature that's an inquiry into the relationship between health and writing, between the body and the book. Its visions of the real, recognisably mappable world are despairing. London's taxi ranks are literally underlaid with the dead. And if this is an ancestor echo of the way that Conrad, after The Secret Agent at the last turn of the century, saw London as a city dark enough to bury 5 million of lives, then Sebald's vision of Paris as new library, his René-like revelation of the dehumanising, administrative, systematic hell of the metropolis of books, which can't fail to call up the René film he doesn't mention, Night and Fog, which redelates nevertheless through his earlier descriptions of Theresienstadt. His vision of the foundation of reading, built on shared theft and guilt, the fascist looting from the Parisian Jews, is a meld of revelation and despair, all his own. His work addresses what he calls in the preface to On the Natural History of Destruction, the looking and looking away at the same time. He works with the opening of the eyes and the opening of the eye, the open first person. He brings us up so close to our own blindnesses, blanks, and ignorances that we see again. And in the vitality of the seeing, in its merging with an all ends in death lugubriousness, there's a contradiction. The closing pages of The Rings of Saturn fuse virtuosity and despair into a new knowing, a new literary expression of pain and, yes, pleasure. Against all the odds, all the evidence, somehow the knowledge of the interconnectings in the crescendo of despair is also consolation. As Sebald put it to Eleanor Wachtel in an interview, tragedy is still a pattern of order, and an attempt to give meaning to something, to a life or to a series of lives. It's still, as it were, a positive way of looking at things. I imagine him with his mournful demeanour firmly on, telling Wachtel, if you imagine the amount of painkillers that are consumed, say, in the city of New York every year, you might be able to make a mountain out of it in which you could go skiing. The late Roger Deakin identified not just the naturalist in Sebald, but also the duality in his work where the bassline of profound anxiety, like the elephants in Forster's description of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in Howard's End, a kind of silent scream like Munch's, sits alongside a much less celebrated puckishness. Sebald as Robin Goodfellow, the genius of whose work is that it can put the girdle round the earth in 40 minutes, take us effortlessly wherever he wants in time or place without the need of narrative sense. And though he's not exactly Sid James, though there is an arguably curmudgeonly connection somewhere there, for in true Sebaldian terms nothing's not connected, Sebald is often funny with a surrealist's caprice. For instance, when the narrator in his giddiest book, Vertigo, finds himself on a bus in Italy, fascinated by how much two sniggering twins resemble the young Kafka, and since he's got no camera and the novel's all about forms of evidence, starts trying to explain the resemblance to the boy's parents. And when he asks if they'll send him a photo of their boys to his English address, Metamorphosis meets Death in Venice. Something funny lines the underside of uncomfortable, and vice versa. The photographs carefully placed through his work are a source of evidence and absence at once, the evidence of a world where silence ends up saying more than words. In The Emigrants, what takes place of language under the force of the thickening silence felt by Max Ferber's parents, Jews under the first pressure of increasing persecution, is cinema. His father going to the cinema more and more often to see cowboy films and the mountaineering films of Louis Trenker, who ended up being an inspiration for the Nazi genius of propaganda image, Leni Riefenstahl. Now, there must be hundreds of thesis papers about the screen in Sebald's work, and about Sebald and Freud and screen memory, repressed elements, our defense against them. But for me, the most telling moment when it comes to notions of image and meaning in Sebald's work occurs in Austerlitz, when Austerlitz, a fictional character desperate in a search for an image of his lost mother, a fictional character, tries to track down a surviving copy of the real propaganda film of Theresienstadt made by the Nazis, a film in which the concentration camp, in the most gruesome of ironies, performs a version of itself as a pleasant holiday spa. What happens is that Austerlitz finds himself helplessly caught up, as it were, in the act. I kept thinking that if only the film could be found, I might perhaps be able to see or gain some inkling of what it was really like. And then I imagined recognizing Agatha beyond any possibility of doubt, perhaps among the guests outside the fake coffee house or among a group of ghetto residents out for a stroll, until at last I thought I could sense her stepping out of the frame and passing over into me. He finds a copy of the film, watches it, and can see nothing. He slows it down so that 15 minutes in Theresienstadt now lasts an hour. He sees a woman in the shadow of a moment and convinces himself she might well be Agatha. The real still of a real woman from the real film is reproduced in the novel. As soon as Austerlitz shows Vera, the fictional character who knew his mother, she verifies it's not Agatha. Then, inserted into the text, there's another photo from elsewhere of someone who apparently really is Agatha. The disturbingness of the terrible paucity revealed by this incident almost rivals the disturbingness of the Nazi experiment, and this is a purposeful revelation. The real loss, left as silent by Sebald, comes in the dismissal of the real woman, whoever she was, in the slowed-down, found image of Theresienstadt, a woman first someone, then no one. If she's not Agatha, then who is she? The real tragedy here, unmentioned, slipping past, almost unregistered, is this woman's. Where history made her nobody, narrative plot has first singled her out and then made her a nobody all over again. Though the slowing of the propaganda machine, I think, to reveal the real weight and distortion of the Nazi vision, I think it must have been influenced by Douglas Gordon's 1993 installation 24-Hour Psycho. I've often wondered too whether Sebald, who latterly taught film studies, for whom film features largely in his prose and who writes about film personally and often in the essays he wrote throughout his career, I wonder if he knew the work of the structuralist New York experimental filmmaker Ken Jacobs. For instance, his 1969 version of a 1905 mutoscope, Tom Tom the Piper's Son, where early film footage is stretched and slowed and stilled and speeded up by what Jacobs calls his Nazi combat camera, until fragments reveal both realism and abstraction, and the coordinates of how we see things are, at some points, physically painfully undone. Get lost, Ken Jacobs says is his advice to his film students, and get lost again. What's found in Sebald is often the twinned opposite, the language in the silence and the silence in the language, the blind in the sight in the blind, the doubleness in the bind. Railway stations are places marked by both blissful happiness and profound misfortune. The fact is, in Sebald, nobody's ever about, Alan Bennett wrote. All the same, quite mysteriously for such works of evidence, solitudinous captivation, Sebald's work is simultaneously heavily peopled, full of voices, multilogues, endlessly surprising meetings with strangers and friends and the dead and the gone lives of various people, all wandering at large. Sebald's working process, an avowal of randomness and plotlessness, provides a sensual revelation of the living shape of things, or the plot right under your nose. You find odd details which lead you somewhere else, he said in an interview, and so it's a form of unsystematic searching in the same way in which, say, a dog runs through a field. If you look at a dog, following the advice of his nose, he traverses a patch of ground in a completely unplottable manner, and he invariably finds what he's looking for. I've always had dogs. I've learned from them how to do this. When Sebald said this in an interview in New York in 2001, the audience laughed. It's typical of Sebald, though, a celebrator of creatures, birds, moths, butterflies, trees, the beyond human, a man who presents the planet itself as a silently vociferous character in his work, to translate the self in this way. And compare, too, the freedom of the dog in this analogy with the repeated images in his work of incarcerated creatures in their uncomprehending state in zoos and cages. Sebald, again, echoing wolf, both hymns and fears, the murmur of the millionfold proliferating mollusks, woodlice, and leeches. He places it alongside the hugeness of the erosive violence of nature itself, held as an equal force of destruction alongside imperialism in the rings of Saturn, a force just as capable of tightening noose-like. It's his metaphor around us. Sebald positions us precariously in the slight slippage between a word like noose and one like nose, the narrator following his nose pervasively on the scent of coincidence in a kind of loitering with intent. Sebald was intent on the of coincidence, the aspect of things coming unexpectedly together. The lack of parenthesis through his writing and what might be called a reluctance about paragraphs textually signal a writer uninterested in dividing. Consider his interest, too, in the non-identifiable nature of his own writing, the openness of its form, and the open or composite narrator who develops over the course of the fictions, and the open or composite writer, too, who makes a feature of other people's work in the window his own work provides. And I remember, Vera told me, said Austerlitz. The pivotal formal device in Austerlitz is that of narrator contained by narrator contained by narrator, with the closeness and disclosure of a set of Russian dolls, or is it the opening outward of rings in the surface of water, or both. Austerlitz is a tale told at a remove at exactly the same time as one told in intimacy, the level of which forms and changes the nature of the narratorial self. It's an art of storytelling in which reported speech becomes a kind of enfolding, a state of inclusion as intimate as breath pattern. In Sebald's writing, what gets found and simultaneously analysed is a force of interconnection. In Vertigo, the narrator draws attention to democracy in a work by Pisanello, in which every feature, the principals and the extras alike, the birds in the sky, the green forest and every single leaf of it, are all granted an equal and undiminished right to exist. Art in Sebald tends to stand both outside and in time, rather like the tree outside Max Ferber's studio in the Manchester wastelands of the emigrants is always in blossom. Sebald can't look away himself from the lived lives of artists and writers, especially their earlier lives, which can be said to have formed them as artists, but more, to quote from his chapter on Stendhal in Vertigo, what is it that undoes a writer? Undoes, as in ruins, or takes apart, or undoes as in loosens, frees? Both. The first prison image in Sebald's literary work turns up directly after an image of the blind having their sight restored. In After Nature, when Sebald's autobiographical narrator goes walking around Manchester on a Sunday looking for Strangeways Prison and instead finds himself in a sort of no man's land in what's left of Manchester's Jewish district. Vertigo's first prisoner, after a very wild dog and animals in incarceration in Sebald's work, is always revelated about the treatment of all living things. The first prisoner in Vertigo is Casanova, writer and lover, flung into the attic dungeons of the Doge's palace in Venice because he's the kind of person their excellencies have decided to remove from society. He escapes by means of the law of coincidence, by finding himself in a future in a seemingly random operation of words and numbers. Freedom, however, involves great loss. Max Ferber, the artist in The Emigrants, recalls his arrival in England and the strange freedom of settling into the foreign school so that it grew steadily harder for me to write my letters home or to read the letters that arrived from home every fortnight. When the letters stopped coming in November 1941, I was relieved at first. Freedom is a state of naivety. Only gradually did it dawn on me I would never again be able to write home. It's also a tortuous business in itself, as Aunt Fanny, commenting on Ambrose Adelworth in the same work, suggests. Telling stories was as much a torment to him as an attempt at self-liberation. He was at once saving himself in some way and mercilessly destroying himself. At one point in The Emigrants, the words jail and oubliette are interchangeable. Hotel rooms rattle their keys throughout his writing. Open doors and windows are a kind of architectural dream of freedom or a terrible charade of hope, as when the friendly, happy folk who had been spared the horrors of war look out of the windows of Theresienstadt's buildings at the Red Cross officials being hoodwinked by the Nazi charade near the end of the very long sentence in Austerlitz, a book whose beginning opens into one of Sebald's repeated analogies, the notion that fortifications built to keep people safe generally end up imprisoning them. To focus for a moment on the horrific connectivity of that 11-page long sentence, on the doggedness of its refutal of all literary naiveties about the glory of connectivity, it leaves a phrase like Forster's only connect hanging ragged, or, rather, cancels the phrase's naivety and rewrites its urgency in the new light, the new dark of the end of the 20th century, reveals Austerlitz as a taking to task of literary mode. The long sentence in Austerlitz about the busily deranged activities of the Nazi authorities at Theresienstadt, Anthea Bell says, I always remember that when I was drafting that, I put a full stop after a couple of pages and then knew at once I mustn't. It's a relentless connectivity machine. It's strung between losses, its final phrase is lost without trace, and it begins directly after Austerlitz considers what gets lost in translation, commenting on the way German, the language, forces words together, compounds them to make new words, and then the sentence in its ruthlessness reveals the detainee sense of compound and compounds us as readers. It is stealthy, it creeps up on its reader in a build-up of panic and inexorability as it piles itself up on itself. At its centre, the revelation of the hecatomb of bodies waiting to be dealt with in the morgue. It keeps itself going like the crematorium, kept going day and night in cycles of 40 minutes at a time. Its couple of anomalies are remarkable. It lightly, ironically, uncharacteristically uses the word medley to describe the carts and hearses which shift the very heavy piles of dead around town. The effect of this word's strange lightness is as devastating as the use later of the first simile in the sentence, when the 40,145 prisoners who've been standing ironically in comparative freedom beyond the gate of the camp for hours in the November cold and rain and dark because the SS men have simply forgotten to dismiss their dawn roll call, are seen as swaying like reeds in the showers that now swept over the countryside. And then it's as if language itself has loosed the obscenity of what might be called the grotesque simile which follows when the Nazis make a concentration camp look like a spa. Up against this foul machine, what do we have? A visit to the old MOD site on Orford Ness, which resembled a penal colony in the Far East, leaves the narrator of The Rings of Saturn liberated with all the loadedness the word has for a writer of Sebald's formation. It was as if I were passing through an undiscovered country, and I still remember that I felt at the same time both utterly liberated and deeply despondent. I had not a single thought in my head. With each step I took, the emptiness within and the emptiness without grew ever greater, and the silence more profound. Liberation here is a kind of death, where the notion that no man is an island is disproved until, that is, the narrator meets in the long grass of the deserted military site another living creature, a hare, terrified by the sight of him, a curiously human expression on its face that was rigid with terror and strangely divided, and which, when it finally leaps out of its paralyzed state, frees him too, as with an undiminished clarity he sees himself become one with it. It's in these liminalities, in the space between lost and found, ruin and construction, imprisonment and liberation, blindness and seeing. It's in what moves, what shifts between states which seem as irreconcilable as fact and fiction, to reveal that nothing is divided, nothing is not connected for the good and the bad, and nothing can be designated alien to us. It's in the revelation of the flayed, displayed fragility of the self both saved and destroyed, that Sebald's act of translation, or vision of cohesion, becomes a match for despair and potent beyond any cliché of hope. Reading Sebald in translation is in many ways the whole point. These questions carry me over the border, he writes in After Nature. Throughout his work, he questions the borders of country, nationality, language, identity, knowledge, art, reality. And what happens when things aren't translated into the spoken language of the present, he says, is that we're left with a broken corpus. In Sebald's writing, human beings, timeless, historic, broken, gone and alive, appear and move and speak above all through the agency of others. If we think of a translation as a skein of interconnectings made by people, not machine, the very act of which resists the absolute, and in which, as Benjamin in translation puts it, the great motif of integrating many tongues into one true language is at work. If we think of translation as a liminal state which admits the never definitive, which moves between the original and the new in the continuing refinement of language as a communal act, typical of the shared project that all writing is. If we admit the ways in which translation goes beyond the self, beyond the broken, beyond the fixed, beyond the only of connect, and to the core of its nature, then we should all aspire to be read in translation, to exist in the between that translation is, in process bigger than ourselves, in the vital state between the words and their possible meanings, between language and all the possible languages. Thank you to all the translators who gave this lecture voice. My own inner German is actually 14 years old, so thank you to the translators who made it possible for me to read the English Sebald. My 48-year-old self is as ashamed as a blushing 14-year-old every time I go abroad and meet the writers all over the world whose work sounds marvellous, but whose work I'll never be able to read unless I learn the languages I wish I'd learned when I was 14, or until we undergo a sea change, a translation into something richer and stranger in UK publishing. I'll give it to... Nearly last word to a translator, George Surtees. Without translation, we'd be ignorant parishes bordered by silence. Thank you to all those who make it possible for me and all readers to leave the village, to enter the state for which we need no proof of identity, the borderless state between readers and books, where we can be anybody and anything, and where we come to understand something key, something Sebald's work is all about, that nothing human is alien to us.
Thank you very much. We have just a couple of minutes for if we have a couple of questions. I think there is a microphone roving. There it is, microphone to the back. So if you would just wave your hands as energetically as you can so I can see you. Actually, can we have the lights back on in the house, please? Ah, that's better. Excellent. Yes, just a couple of questions if you have.
Anything? I made it long, especially so we'd miss questions, actually.
In that case, I'm going to ask. I'm going to take the prerogative of having a microphone attached to me here so I can speak, and I'm going to ask one thing while you gather your thoughts, which is speaking as a reader. What is the difference in the experience when you're reading a translation? Are you conscious when you're reading something which is translated to something which is not?
I think that no, actually, I think you're really not. But then I don't know whether that's my decision as a reader to determinedly not be conscious. I don't know. I kind of think every book reads like a translation, and every book reads like a book. I mean, you read some English books you're reading in English in the original language, and they're reading like you feel like they've been really badly translated. So I think basically all good writers are really good translators, is what I think. Actually.
One question from yes on the aisle here, if you could just.
Thank you very much, Ali. It was an extraordinary lecture. I just wonder if there are implications for gender in translation on the part of the translator. I don't offer that question with any, loaded direction to it, but it seems to me that there must be implications for it in some way, both in terms of receptivity and then what is passed onwards.
I know that when I was away in a retreat in the States a couple of years ago, a German writer I met there got very excited by the fact that in English I could have characters who were genderless. And she said, you can do this, we can't do this, I wish we could do this. I realized then there was a real freedom in English for question and for openness in a way that other languages are simply not going to happen. I mean, in a way, I wonder about the consequence for my own work, which is genderless, to be translated. I have no idea how that's working, abroad, where whether they'll translate it into women or men or women and men, I don't know. But actually, you saying the word gender has made me say the thing which, had I had an extra hour and a half, I'd have said about Sebald, which is, I wish someone would do some work on Sebald and gender. He's so, and this is not answering your question directly, Gareth, but he's so interesting about margins and the margins and men in the margins. And there's a peculiar kind of standoffishness in his work about women. And I would, given a year and time to sit in a room with just Sebald's books, I would look at that really closely and see what came of it, because nothing in Sebald is accidental, nothing in Sebald is not considered. I'd love to know what this kind of slight bristling sense in him is. There's something about brotherhood in his work which does not pass over to women, and I kind of want to know more about that. But I don't know that his most kind of giddy novel is Vertigo, which is his love novel. It's his novel which is a love story, in which which allows for there to be some kind of love narrative. Maybe he simply can't put together the two genders in a way that he can put, if he's not going to be writing that kind of narrative. I don't know.
I'm afraid I'm going to stop it there. It's okay. Just before we go, a couple of things. As Paula said, the books of all the prize winners and Ali's books are going to be for sale in the foyer if you would like to buy them and get them signed. And just a few thank yous before we go. The Society of Authors, Paula Johnston, of course, and Sarah Baxter, who kind of put this whole show together. Peter Stoddart for giving the prizes out, the sponsors of all of the prizes, to King's Place, of course, for hosting us, at BCLT to our fantastic coordinator, Catherine Fuller, who just kind of sits quietly at the end of the corridor and magically makes things happen. To all of you for coming, but most of all, please join me in thanking one more time Ali Smith.